Fairy bread. It's an Australian party classic, a food so cheap and simple that it doesn't matter if you're at a party in Blacktown or Bondi, you'll find it. Fairy bread is just 3 ingredients: white bread, spreadable butter, and hundreds and thousands. Despite this, it continues to confuse and infuriate seppos and poms alike. No, it's not a replacement for cake. Why are you cutting the crusts off? Cream cheese? What the fuck are you doing? Why are you making it worse? Isn't it weird that a dish so easy and cheap to make is unique to 2 countries and their diaspora, especially with all these Northern European dishes that are similar but entirely unrelated? It turns out that the history of fairy bread is really weird and everyone is wrong about it. Wikipedia, ANU's Dictionary of Australian Slang, and so many articles about this bit of food completely miss the mark. Theoretically, someone could have made fairy bread in Sydney in 1822. That's the first time that we can find evidence of hundreds and thousands in Australia, sold right here at 18 Pitt Street in Sydney. We know basically nothing about hundreds and thousands back then, but they were probably a little bigger than the ones we have today, and all white rather than being dyed different colours. At this point, they were exclusively a decoration on other things like cakes, and were generally not accessible to the general public. It's not until the late 19th century that we start getting hits for fairy bread. In 1885, Scottish-Australian poet Robert Louis Stevenson published his compilation A Child's Garden of Verses, and this poem usually gets the credit for introducing the concept of a fairy bread. There are 2 problems with this story, though. Firstly, fairy was used as an adjective in this period, and it was most likely being used in this way by Stevenson. Think magical bread or mystical bread rather than some separate thing. 2, there were an awful lot of fairies going around in the late Victorian era, especially in literature. The modern idea of a fairy was conceived at about this time, and there was a hobby interest in magic and the supernatural that permeated a lot of the culture that survives. Even fairies having their own type of bread was not an idea unique to Stevenson. This idea is way bigger than just a fairy bread video, but the names we use for things and the actual thing it describes are separate. Names can and do move from one thing to another over time. Like, all of these people have been the Yellow Wiggle, but only one of them is Greg. I bring this up because this recipe from the Perth Sunday Times from the 14th September 1913 says this is fairy bread. It's this weird tea cakey thing that's baked in a pie dish before you turn it out and serve it. It's honestly pretty good in like a sourdough way, but this obviously isn't fairy bread, right? At the time of writing, the Wikipedia article on fairy bread has a quote from the Hobart Mercury in April 1929 that starts with the phrase, "The children will start their party with fairy bread and butter and hundreds and thousands." That is fairy bread being listed as an ingredient because it's probably something like this. There are recipes similar to this one up and down the country in the early parts of the 20th century, until after the Second World War. And honestly, yeah, it's not too bad. A bit messy, and it's hard to keep the hundreds and thousands on, but it's pretty good. From a dish like this, you can extrapolate a simple story. Clearly, there were these fairy bread loaves, then people started putting hundreds of thousands on them to create a sweet dish, then people started doing that with white bread when it became cheap in the 50s, and the name moved from this to what we have today. Let me read you something. There was a beautiful cake frosted over and ornamented with flowers, and large plates of cherries, and strawberries, and sponge cakes, and numbers of little glass saucers filled with conversations and bonbons, and all sorts of nice lollies. And then also Mrs. Reed had not forgotten to have plenty of thin bread and butter sprinkled over with hundreds and thousands, which the children are so especially fond of. That was written by Caroline Clark in a book published posthumously by her husband Alfred in 1886. Caroline died in 1884, so this event could have been any time from the 1860s to the 1880s. This fairy bread dish is nearly 150 years old. It's older than the Stevenson poem, it's older than this loaf, it's older than the name it would be given. I don't know if Mrs. Reed was an innovator here. Earlier than this, the recorded trail goes completely cold. If she was the first, then I think it's nice that a mum just trying to make a cheap treat for the kids on the far outskirts of Melbourne made something that has kept that place ever since. The weirdness isn't over yet, though. The first recorded time that this food is given the name fairy bread is actually from a Sydney Morning Herald article in 1934, where it's offered as a suggested dessert food for toddlers at a Christmas dinner. At this time, you also see the name fairy bread being given to Melba toast, which is this odd thing used to make stale bread more edible and also was a dieting food. This is actually the more popular use of the name right through the 30s and 40s. Into the 1950s, you see all 3 of these definitions, all sharing the name fairy bread, all coexisting in Australian culture, even in the same magazines. And then, the results stop. From the mid-1950s to the late 1960s, the entire childhood of the baby boomer generation, there are no archived records of fairy bread of any kind. Once it picks up again in the 70s, it's all about bread, butter, and hundreds and thousands. What happened here? This is the childhoods of the baby boomers, the largest generation in Australia by far, and no one had written about what they were having at the massive number of birthday parties? And why did the other two just vanish? I'm not going to pretend to have an answer here. As we move through the 70s and 80s, fairy bread starts being invoked as a party classic more and more, which does imply that the boomers were eating quite a lot of it. In the 1990s, there's references to it being in the memory of oldies, and someone named their racehorse fairy bread too. The dish also starts to get noticed for its cheapness and the ease with which you can feed a large crowd of people, which I'm sure has contributed to how it has seemed to stay universal. Into the 2010s, it's been satirized, there's a fairy bread day sponsored by the only hundreds and thousands manufacturer we have, and it's being talked about more and more as an Australian cultural thing, both here and internationally. I don't know if the strange twists and turns in the history of this treat say anything about Australia. At the time this food was developing its classic status, no one decided to write about it. It just wasn't that important, until suddenly it was. If I had a 5-figure per month Patreon, there'd be a 20-minute section about capitalism here, but I don't need to spend my money on backgrounds. I've got this.